right, let's find a seat and get rolling. I haven't timed this out, so hopefully it'll be just right. So this is Introduction to Ember.js. As I started to put this presentation together, I realized, perhaps for the first time since I've been doing Ember for a while now, that the amount of surface area to Ember and the amount to learn is quite extraordinary. So I tried for this to be a survey, but it at least touches on most of the important concepts, I hope. And there's plenty that's not touched here. I hope to refine. So real quick, I live here in Chelsea. I have 2 little girls, play beach volleyball, and I run a company called Yap that does a whole ton of Ember stuff. My relevant development experience that I feel like has prepared me well for Ember is doing WPF back in 2005. Anybody know what WPF is? Windows Presentation Framework, yep. Shared a lot of concepts with Ember. A lot of data binding stuff, declarative templates. Rails is an inspiration to Ember, as most of you know, in terms of convention over configuration and in a general concept of developer happiness and productivity. Sprout Core is the actual precursor to Ember. Ember started its life as Sprout Core 2. When we were using Sprout Core and sort of went over that transition to Sprout Core 2 with the core team, which is how I stumbled into Ember early on. So my experience building Ember apps is all through Yap. Yap is, for those of you who don't know, is the easiest way to create your own mobile app. So we're aimed at consumers. We're aimed at providing a super polished user experience, both on the phone as well as our editor experience, which is based in a web browser on a desktop or your iPad. We've had tons of great coverage, including the Wall Street Journal comparing our software to Apple, which was perhaps one of the highlights of my career. But I attribute a lot to what we were able to create to the power that Ember gives you. And so just to give you a sense of the apps that I've worked on, our mobile app is a cross-platform Android and iOS experience that's built in Ember, runs via PhoneGap. Our editor is a rich desktop-style app. That was sort of a sweet spot for the old Sprout Core experience. Kind of, if you think about iPhoto or something like that, that's what that kind of experience is. Dashboard is kind of a simple one-pager, mostly navigation, light functionality. And then our account settings is our newest thing, which was we did in Ember Master, very recent Ember Master, which is more of a form field heavy experience, which taught us a lot too. So with that, the goals of the talk tonight are to develop an understanding of application structure and division of responsibilities when you're building a non-toy Ember app, something larger than, to Michael's point, larger than a to-do app. And I think that that kind of overview I know helps me when I'm starting to learn something new, because I get a sense of the overall structure and then can dive in and focus in different places as I'm learning. But I also want to communicate some of those, what are those fundamental building blocks that make up that kind of structure. And conceptually, I think 98% of building good apps is understanding your layers and knowing what code should go where. And the other 2% is probably knowing where to look up what you don't know. So lay of the land, MVC. We've all been doing now MVC probably, if I were to guess, for a number of years. But MVC, as you probably have also found out, is not created equal. Lots of different flavors of MVC. In particular, C is for controller, and David Yang was just asking me about this. But controller means many different things in many different MVC patterns. And so we'll look at what controller means in Ember. And I think of this also as MVC plus R, the R being for router. The router is kind of, you'll see, is kind of the skeleton of your Ember app. Everything would just be a puddle on the floor without it. The other aspect that I want to encourage you to think about, particularly if you're coming from jQuery, as you mentioned, building an Ember app is being a professional software UI engineer. So if you've never thought of yourself that way before, you might want to start. There's a lot of different sorts of requirements when you're working on persistent UIs. Long-lived state is probably the #1 difference between the request response-based MVC that you might have done in Rails or another server-side framework. And UI responsiveness is another thing to think about. You can't grab your single thread that you got in your browser and occupy it if you want the user to be able to interact with your page at all. So you have to be smart about that kind of stuff. And generally, in terms of Ember, we are at a 1.0 release candidate cycle. We'll be at RC2 shortly, probably tonight or tomorrow. The Ember API has stabilized. We are being pretty strict about API breaking API changes at this point. Some new APIs will be added during the 1.x cycle, but we will not break, or at least try not to break any APIs until 2.0. Ember 1.0 final is coming real soon now. So, thinking about an Ember app. These are the layers of your app. You got your models. Most people are familiar with it. These are kind of your business objects, if you will. They're the nouns in your system. You've got your controllers, your views, your templates. You can think of views and templates together as your view layer. And then you've got your router, which is going to sit here and coordinate those things. So here's the overall app data flow for a well-constructed Ember app. Data is going to flow down from the model through controllers, views, and templates, and becoming HTML through bindings. Thinking about this direction is really important to understanding where the dependencies lie and sort of what knows about what. A lot of, a big part of software development is probably know is information hiding. Right? You want to be able to deal with just the collaborators that you need to know about right now. Otherwise, you end up with a nasty mess of spaghetti. Events flow up from the view layer to the router. So what's an event in an Ember app? This is a web app, right? Oh, yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, so the question was, what's the relationship between a model and a controller? It can be, typically it's going to be one-to-one or a collection of homogeneous models to one controller. But you also have relationships between models, which is kind of what I was trying to show here, and you'll see it illustrated more clearly in a future slide, where I, as a user, might have many posts in a blog, right? Or a post might have many comments. So there's relationships there at that level. I don't know if I could even tell you what it, so the question was, is Ember a pure MVC pattern? And the context was, Backbone says right off the bat, hey, we are not a pure MVC pattern. I would say that Ember is probably more of a full-featured MVC framework than Backbone is, but I don't know if I could describe anything as pure for the reason I described before. Every MVC implementation has a different sort of sense of what is a controller, what are the responsibilities of a controller, even what are views. Varies across implementations. So hard to say about pure, but definitely there are distinct models, views, and controllers in Ember. They have specific responsibilities, and we have the addition of the router, which we'll talk about where that fits in. So the events in this pink line or purple line where the events are flowing up, these are typically user interaction. So it's a mouse click or touch, a keyboard command, or someone entering something into a field. And so this is going to flow up from the bottom, making its way either to the controller or to the router. At this point, the router initiates some change in the world, right? This is typically going to be changing a property on a model or a controller. And at that point, the loop continues. Those changed properties becomes data that flows down through bindings, and your views are updated. So we're now going to look at sort of each of these layers in some depth, and feel free to ask questions as we go. So models. We talked about before, Matt asked about backend. Models are usually serialized and deserialized to and from an API. Not always. In Alex's example, he had some YAML that he transformed into JSON and consumed in his app. But more typically for an app that you're building in any kind of commercial setting, you're going to have an API that you're communicating with. So in terms of what models interact with, models should not know anything about controllers. They should not know about routers, should not know about views, and they should not know about templates. They should be concerned with the sort of core information and behavior of your domain. Now, models do often depend on other models. This is kind of the question that you were asking. Has many relationships, belongs to relationships. Certainly it makes sense and help to model the domain of the problem that you're solving. So something that you may not be familiar with is the concept of an identity map. And when you're doing client-side development, an identity map becomes really, really important. What it says is that if I ask for person ID 5, I'll say as an example, and I ask for that over here in one part of my app, and then I ask for it over here in another part, I'm going to get the same instance. That may seem obvious, but unless you do something to make it happen, then you might just have, populate an object from the API for ID 5 over here and a different one for here, and if you change this person's name, then this object's name still remains the same. So an identity map is an important tool to have in your Ember tool chest, and we'll look at the most popular implementation of that. For a model to work well with the router, the model should implement two things. One is a find method, and so we'll look at some of the conventions in Ember, but basically when you visit a route like person/5 and your router, Ember is going to assume that it's going to go get a model named person and call find with 5 on it. And then the other thing that it will respect is the promises pattern. So if retrieving information about person 5 is an asynchronous operation, as it typically would be if you are accessing an API, then it's going to wait for that to be successful if you implement then. And models should be testable in isolation. And that should be easy since they have no dependencies besides each other. So now so I described some of the things that are important for working with models successfully. How do we get these things? So Ember data is one route to do that. We use Ember data in, I think, all of our apps at this point. Ember data is a ORM for Ember, you can think of it as. Now, obviously, because it's talking to an API and not a database, it's a little bit different from the ORMs that you might be familiar with. Active Record and Rails, probably most famous example. Ember data consists of a few different things, probably the most important of which are a store, where your models are stored and functions as an identity map, an adapter, which helps to communicate and define the communication to your API, and a serializer, which is responsible for taking stuff in the representation that your API gives you and transforming it into a fully populated Ember object, and vice versa. REST adapter is designed, implements a bunch of these translations and communication patterns to work well with a standard REST interface. And problem is, as soon as you start to investigate what a standard REST interface or API is, there's not quite a standard. There's a bunch of conventions that people usually follow, but there's reasonable disagreements among reasonable people about what that standard should be. So what REST adapter uses is as implemented with Rails and active model serializers. So if you're using that, great. If not, then that's the pattern that you want to follow with your backend to plug into REST adapter most smoothly. There's a new part of Ember data that's just been recently going in called Basic Adapter, which is a much simplified adapter that's similar to closer to the backbone persistence story, where there's basically a sync method that gets called when you want to commit changes back to your API, and that sync method is up to you to implement. So Ember data is a work in progress compared to Ember core. It's much less, API is much less stable. There are more bugs, and it is changing and and breaking in ways that may cause you grief if you're not somebody who likes to live on the bleeding edge. Fortunately, there's an alternative to Ember data if you're not ready for that, and that's keeping it simple and using $.ajax to communicate with your API. As was mentioned before, jQuery is a hard dependency of Ember, so you've already got jQuery if you're successfully executing any Ember code. And you probably also have a lot of experience working with $.ajax. So you would in this approach, you would subclass Ember.object to define your model classes, and then you would set properties, instantiate and set properties in those objects to retrieve data and to persist data, pull that stuff off into JSON, and send it back up to your API. A great example, if you want to see this in action, is the Discourse project that I mentioned earlier. Uses this approach. Yeah.
So if you do that, you have to implement like DS store or?
So you would probably want some kind of identity map. Now, it's actually not that hard to implement a simple identity map on your own. You basically just need to route access to your objects through some central object, and then have a registry. So when you instantiate and return person 5, you stick it in a hash and say person 5 : this object, and check that before you go to the API next time. So you don't get an identity map for free. It is possible, and we've done this a few places. It is possible to use DS store kind of on its own with the approach of instantiating your own DS model instances. So there's some hybrid between those two approaches that I mentioned. Other questions on models?
If you start a new project right now, and you want to use Ember data, what are the things that are going to burn?
So I think the roughest edges in Ember data today. The question was, if you're starting a new project today and you want to use Ember data, what's going to burn you? And so I think the places where the rough edges are relationships. Has many relationships, and particularly around persisting them. Retrieving them from the database. So if you've got a read-heavy app that's mostly going to be reading data and presenting it in a nice way, you're probably okay. If you're going to be then making changes to various sides of those relationships and persisting it back, that's pretty rough right now, and changing. The other thing that I would say is that when you're committing changes to more than one model at one time, the API is pretty ugly around waiting for those things to be done. So what we would like to be able to do is to be able to say transaction or store.commit and have that be a promise that when that promise is resolved or rejected, everything's been successfully saved or not in the case of rejection. We're moving that direction, but we're not there yet. Jake?
Right now, so I'm just trying to think about all the stuff that we had. The serializer, there's a bunch of bugs in the serializer where they have this concept of embedding objects versus side loading them, and they have two switches. Basically, one's I think it's always versus load, and it's supposed to be that load means it's going to be embedded on when you're reading from the API, but when you write back to the API, it shouldn't be embedded, but it actually embeds the objects. Unless you customize the serializer right now. Always would be, you always want it to be embedded. There's a few other things too. If you start to write a real application with Ember data, you're gonna have to read the source to see exactly what's happening. Read the open issues on GitHub and kind of weigh whether you want to go onto the head of master or not at any given moment.
Yeah, I think that's definitely accurate. This is the advice that I used to give people about Ember 6 months ago applies to Ember data now, which is that if you are comfortable sort of being on the edge and reading commits on a regular, daily basis, contributing bug fixes, etc., then Ember data is a fun place to be, and you get to shape the future of it and make sure that it's it evolves in a way that's compatible with your app and really serves your needs well. If that's not you and you kind of want something out of the box that you can run with, then you should wait on that front. I don't know of so the question was, let's say you're building an editor kind of app where you want to take a model that you've got and make a copy of it and clone it to then work on again. Is there a best practice or idiomatic way to do that in Ember or Ember data? I don't know of a kind of typical way to do it. I mean, I think that what I would do is I would take if you can call serialize on a model, which is going to give you a JSON representation of it, and you can call create record and give it the serialized JSON. That's going to give you a new record with that same data. You may need to change that data if you want to remove an ID, for example, because you want a new ID for the new record. But does anybody know of anything more idiomatic than that? Yeah, I think that you can do that. In this case, and that would be fine if you're using Ember objects as opposed to the Ember data. If you're using Ember data, you want to make sure that that new object is in the store, et cetera. So cool. Any other questions on models?
Well, Raoul, if you decide to not really use Ember data for online reasons, are there any sort of best practices about designing your data access layer?
I'm trying to think. The things that we've done have worked well. So, so one thing that I would certainly think about is a kind of standard. A part of what makes Ember really powerful is the standard conventions and stuff. So when I'm going off the beaten path, something that Ember doesn't support, like Ember doesn't really have a concept of a data access layer because Ember data generally is the vision is that it will provide that. Or we integrate with the pusher service to push data down, and so the idea of having objects that listen on channels and do things is something that is useful in one of our apps. Those things, I think it's really useful to think about. Okay, if I was designing Ember and this was going to be a core part of those building blocks that I showed, how would I approach that? And so to kind of define like a standard naming convention so that you can have a separate kind of folder in your project that has things that are named consistently with your controllers and models and stuff like that. That would probably be the number one thing.
If I design my API to say it's similar, let's say this Ember data,
Yes.
Ember hooks into that.
Yeah, totally. So the APIs between parts of the app are pretty well defined and they're pretty clean. So the thing I mentioned, so if you implement find and you implement the promises pattern on your models, then your model is going to basically work with your router. And if you have any questions about those APIs and stuff like that, asking about that on Stack Overflow is a great place. For those of you who don't know, Stack Overflow is kind of the core Q&A place, and members of the core team and contributors to Ember check it regularly, the Ember.js tag, make sure you tag your question for help. So yeah, that should basically work fine. It's going to take a little digging sometimes to figure out, okay, what is that clean public API, but it's almost always there. And the thing that actually I love most about working with Ember and is hard to convey in an intro talk, but is that all of these things that we're talking about break down into very composable units that each kind of make sense and have clear APIs on their own. So as you learn sort of each of those layers, going sort of down to the core fundamental building blocks of the project, you can say, oh, I know, now I can drop down and I can use Ember object on its own. I can use mixins, for my own purposes, and I see how you can sort of see how the Ember source code uses it itself. Cool. So controllers. So, and again, this is going to be something to try to forget what you know about controllers and other projects for now, and this is where controllers fit in Ember. So controllers present, I think the easiest way to think about it is that they present data for the view layer to render. And so these little shaped purple blocks there are supposed to represent property names and mostly properties, I guess, that are represented, that the view will access to render things. Now, what's interesting is that the controller is presenting this sort of clean API to the view, but I guess we'll get to that in a second. So here's an example of some of these bindable properties. So this is a to-dos controller, to go back to our simple example. And there's two properties here. One is the to-dos themselves, which is going to be a collection, which you might bind to render a collection of to-dos on the screen. And the second is a remaining property. And remaining is going to be a number that's going to be computed by looking at the isDone property of each member of this to-do array. And it's going to filter for the ones that are not done and then count them up. From the views perspective, or templates perspective, there's just two properties, to-dos and remaining. So thinking about what is the controller going to expose to the view is powerful. Now, hold your thought for a minute. So what's really powerful here is that those properties may be, as we just saw, properties that exist solely in the controller, or they may be things that proxy properties of models. So for example, if I have a person controller and I get the first name, if your controller is an object controller, which can proxy to a model object, and I say I want to get the first name property. If the first name property is not defined in the controller, it's going to go automatically and look at the model instance for you and get the first name from that. So this is awesome because it is, as I wrote here, a destroyer of boilerplate. There's very little code there, but it just works properly. It also gives you a great hook where if you decide that from now on first names need to be checked, and if they're Alex, then they need to be blanked out for security reasons. You can do that in the controller layer without changing your view, because your view would still be rendering first name. Just to look at an example of that, here's a to-do controller. So it's got a single object, a content object, which is going to be to-do. And if we create an instance of that controller, we have a to-do object with a title called floss. Got to remember to do that. And we set the content of this controller to the to-do. If I then do controller.getTitle, which is equivalent to what a template's going to do if you want to render the title property, it's going to see title is not defined anywhere here. It's going to fall back to the property of the content object and return the string floss. Questions on those? Michael? Yes. So, for example, this is what the question is. If you're talking about property dependencies, what is a property dependent on? It's not enough to just say person if you really care about the person's first name changing. So let's look at this one as an example, our remaining property. This in Ember parlance is called a computed property. So a simple property would be just if I just said first name : Alex, then that's a simple property, and I can say controller get first name, and it would give me Alex. Here I would say controller get remaining, and it's actually a function that's going to get executed the first time. And if I observe this property, which is it's how data binding works in Ember, it's going to rerun this property each time it changes. The problem is, how do we know when it should change? We don't want to just be running this over and over and over and over again every time the user makes a move, moves their mouse on the screen. And so what we say is we call property on this function, and we say it's dependent on this property path. And you'll notice that this is a sort of a chained property path. It's to-dos, and then a reference to each element in the to-dos array, and then to the isDone property. So to your question, if I just did property to-dos, and that was it, then I went and I changed I added an element, say, to the to-dos list, this wouldn't fire, because to-dos is an array, and that array itself did not change. It has a different number of elements, but it's still the same array. And that's the same thing in your question about person. If I want to depend on person last name and I just declare a dependency on person, well, the person didn't change, it just has a different name. So you have to be specific about what you want to observe. And the way that Ember works is it's going to install observers at each element of this chain. And so if to-dos does change, give it a brand new array, then this will fire for me and I'll get an updated remaining. But if all you do is you change the isDone property of one of them, it's also going to fire. So the question is, what if you just had todos.each and not isDone? When would that fire? That would fire if the membership of that array changed. So if you removed something, it would fire. If you added something, it would fire.
Is that the same with
The last question, yes, it's the same. You can't, I believe, if I remember correctly, you can't chain a property off of that the way you can do isDone here. Yes. I think that this is probably not necessary. What I wanted to describe that that content was started off null and that I was setting it. However, there's some interesting related stuff in your question, which is because object controllers proxy models. I described the proxy in case of getting something, right? Of getting the first name automatically from the user or of getting the title from this to-do item. However, they also proxy sets. So if I said controller.setTitle, comma, brush your teeth, then it's going to go and try to set that on the content object because the controller itself doesn't have a title property. So if you actually wanted to set something on the title, but that thing was going to start off as null, you would want to explicitly declare it as null so that those sets don't fall through to the underlying model object when you don't want them to. Other questions? So you would say, let me go to this other, back to, sorry, this one. So what we could say here is we could say comma, to-dos, dot, add each, dot, almost done. Yeah, just multiple, these are called dependent keys, and you can have multiple dependent keys. Okay, let's see what's next. So what's next? We talked about object controller proxying a model. But in the case of the to-dos controller, it was kind of a little fake that I just had an array there, right? Because really that's, you're going to want your to-dos to be persisted in some way, and so they're really going to be model objects, and your to-dos controller should have a collection of these model objects. So this is where array controller comes into play. An array controller is going to work similarly to object controller in that it's going to proxy an array. And so here we can say we're going to create an instance of to-dos controller, which is subclass is array controller. And then we're going to create an array of to-dos, and we're going to set the content of controller. And now we can do things like ask the controller its length. Now, there's no length object here. There's no length computed property here. But it understands that it's going to proxy this to content. So it's going to go and say, hey, array of to-dos, how long are you? And I'm going to return 2 for you. And if you were to bind something in your template, and we'll look in a minute about how to do that, to say length of how many to-dos, maybe you want a number in the upper right-hand corner. As that length changes, it's going to automatically update the template for you. So we talked earlier about needs. Remember the needs property in Jeopardy? And about how that works. And this is not exactly the same, but it's a very similar mechanism. And so I just want to explain, I think we understand how models get created in the course of an Ember application, right? Typically, you're going to make some request for an API, populate an object. It's going to get stored hopefully in an identity map like ds.store. And that's the kind of the life cycle. Probably will stick around for a lot of your app. Maybe you're going to destroy and unload them from the store depending on the usage patterns. Controllers, by contrast, are created once, and then they pretty much stick around forever. And there are some exceptions to this, in like the control example we were talking about earlier, but by and large, and for the purposes of this talk, we can just think of them as singletons, created once. They are created lazily, so the first time that you need one, it's going to be created, and this is how they're created. So in a route, if I went to /to-do/5, or let's say /person/5 was the example I was using before, it's going to look up the model as we talked about, but it's also going to look up the person controller. And this is how it does it. It's going to say controller for person, and the model is typically not going to be passed here. It may if you are routing internally in your application as opposed to just going to the URL in our example. So it's going to look up the container, which is the dependency injection and resolution vehicle in Ember. And containers know how to basically look up classes and instantiate them. So it's going to say container.lookup controller:person, and the container is going to translate that to app, or your app name, .person controller, and if it has not already been instantiated, it's going to instantiate for you. It's for you. Now, the second section we'll look at a little bit later, but it's interesting if the preview is that if you don't have a person controller, it's going to generate a very basic one for you. That basic one is going to be an object controller, which you set your model on, and it will proxy right through it. So it's interesting because when you think about that grid of structure of your project and relationships, you don't have to actually write the code for all of those pieces necessarily if all you want is vanilla behavior. Yeah, lazy instantiation. So the first time that you request a controller, yeah. So it happens inside of the container. So when we say container.lookup, now lookup is part of the API for a container, and containers that knows how to resolve classes, instantiate them, and as a registry for keeping track of what it's created so far. So you can think of it almost as an identity map for your controllers. So we talked about controllers collaborating with other controllers, and here's an example of using needs. So if my profile controller needs access to the user controller, because let's say we want to render the username, then I would say needs user and create a username property, which this is wrong, I think. I could say this.controller for user, get username. So probably a better way to do this would be to have a single username property, which returns this.controller for user. Sorry, a single user controller property, this.controller for user, and then I could depend on user.username for my username property. The needs doesn't do that automatically. There's some talk about having it do that automatically, like set up a user controller property for you or something. But right now, all it does is it makes it so that this doesn't blow up. You would normally not be able to do this unless you explicitly say, hey.
Sorry, maybe to be missing on
Yeah.
the controller for, but like, the idea was that it would put, you have this controller property on
Oh, that's right.
basic controllers that
Yes.
user can
So let's unfortunately, I cannot live edit this because it's that is an image, but we can. So we would say needs user, and then you could say username function. We'll fill in the middle in a second. It's going to depend on controllers.user.username. It's going to return this.get controllers.user.username. And you guys see that? And this pattern, where we're depending on a key and returning the same key, comes up enough that there's a nice shorthand available where we can just say username is ember.computed.alias controller.user.username. So this right here is equivalent to this. And then if you want it to be a little bit shorter, one thing I'll just mention is that em is an alias of Ember, so you can use in your own code as well. Yeah, the nice thing about this is that because there's not this function in here, right here, this .controller4 is not something that you can observe the way that you can observe controllers, right? So this is just a property, controllers versus this is a function. So now in practice, controllers.user is probably not going to change. It's not necessarily that big of a deal, but this is definitely the way to do it. So again, just to be clear, you would not need this. You could just say needs user, and then say username, em.computed alias controller. So thank you. Sorry about that mistake. Okay. So controllers may also be testable in isolation. You may want to test a cluster of things like a controller with a view or a controller with a model if you're concerned about some of those interactions. Any other questions about controllers before we hit views? Jake? Yes. Yeah, so the question is needs superseding controller 4, because controller 4 has a deprecation warning. Yeah, needs is the public API. That's going to be supported. Yeah, so the question was, if I could paraphrase, correct me if I missed it, is that in Jake's application, they have a bunch of properties on application controller that are referenced from mixins that are used in different parts of the application. And what that means is that everything would have to have needs application in order for the local controller to have access to those properties. And that seems bad. I agree with you, that does seem bad. But I think that the smell is that you're storing all these things in application control. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. So there's a few things come to mind. One is the dependency injection framework of like the container stuff is relatively undocumented and not being thought of really as like part of like the public API that every app developer is going to use and interact with, but it's super powerful. and it certainly is public API. So the idea what you can do is you can register a type injection, and you can basically, using container, you can say, for every time a controller is instantiated, I want to set this object on it. And so that object could be somewhat like a shared state object of some sort. That would be my first, off the top of my head, thought about how maybe to do that. And I don't know if it solves the problem or not, but the other thought is, maybe there's like a base controller for your project that mixes in some of this stuff.
So in the previous example, you're taking the user from the controller to get the user. I'm used to the backdoor paradigm where you
Okay.
have this like controller thing. How do you, if I had multiple, let's say I have multiple views of my user model,
Yeah.
canonically I'd be like, I go directly to my user model and I don't have to control it. In Ember, why do you decide to make a new controller and same model? And how does that like play into
Well, so I think the question is, if I have multiple views that represent a user, why wouldn't I just have multiple views that talk directly to the model? And if that's true, if you actually just have that, then that's fine. You can just use the automatically generated object controller that'll just proxy everything through to the model. You don't have to write that code. It just springs into being. But when that changes, and there's something about the data the view of this user that you want to represent that does not belong in the model because it's not domain logic. It's more presentation-y. Maybe it's temporary transient state that's good for this session of the user, not going to be persisted, for example. So for example, it could be some, I don't know, like if we were doing a email app like Gmail and you have check marks next to all of your email items so that you can act on them. When I check a whole bunch of those, it's not going to persist those check marks to the API, but I want them to be stored somewhere so that when I say delete or spam, I know which ones to act on. And so it's this idea of like transient state the controller is the perfect place for that. You're not polluting your model. You certainly don't want something like that in your view, right? That's kind of crazy because it's not just presentation, it's functional. And then the awesome thing about like the active generation is that if you don't need it, don't write it. But when you do need it, there's a place for it. All you have to do is create an instance of that, create a definition for that class, and it'll start being used. Sure. All right, let's see what is next. The view layer. So David asked me at the break about, said, I know that in order to get really good at Ember, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, forgive me. I know that in order to get really good at Ember, I'm gonna have to read some source code. And I'm cool with that. That's part of how I learn. It's good. But what should I read? There's a lot of code there. And one of the things that I recommended to him as a sort of foundational thing is reading the view code and understanding how the view layer works. So as I mentioned before, the view layer consists of views and templates. And all DOM interaction happens in the view layer. That's generating HTML as well as handling DOM events. In fact, if you were to pull Ember View and Ember Handlebars packages out, you could run the rest of this Ember system for some kind of server-side MVC framework. It's pretty useful tool set. These are I mentioned there's a hard jQuery dependency. This is dependent on jQuery. There's stuff in Ember data that's dependent on $.ajax, but none of this stuff has a jQuery dependency. So again, if it's DOM related, it's going to be in a view or a template, and if you're tempted to put it somewhere else, resist. So view classes. We're going to talk about templates, and we're going to talk about view classes. View classes responsibilities. First, I'm going to mention, just like we talked about how controllers, if you don't need them, they will just be, you'll have an anonymous one generated for you. The same thing is true about views. And you will actually not need view classes even more frequently than you won't need controllers. because really Vue class's responsibilities primarily are to translate primitive events, clicks, mouse downs, drag start in Corey's example earlier tonight. You're going to take those and you're going to translate them into semantic events that get passed up to the controller and router layers to affect app state. And we want to let handlebars do the heavy lifting. So here's my people list view. It's an Ember view subclass, and it defines a template name property, people list. And here's that people list handlebars template, some standard HTML, and then an each helper. This will reference the people property of the controller. Hello, full name, property of each person. And the each, we'll talk more about this in a few minutes, so don't worry if you don't fully understand it. This is what would be generated for you. So if this is all that you need in your view, you can just not write it, which is cool. Reminds me a little bit of the original Rails screencast. Look at all the things I'm not typing. So let's look at templates now. We're going to go through a bunch of the handlebars helpers. There may be some that you're familiar with, some that you're not. And I'm going to describe it in the context of what we've been learning about controllers and models. So double curly brace, this is why it's called handlebars. It's a handlebars mustache on its side. First name, also in double curly braces, last name. We'll look at this one in a second. So this is, anybody know what this is going to do? Spit out the person's first name, right? And if the first name changes, it's going to automatically update. And that's kind of the magical part. That's the part that normally, if you're writing an old kind of jQuery application, you would have some kind of ID or data attribute or special class name, and then when that part of your app happens, you would say $ find this in the DOM and set its HTML or set its value, set its text. You don't have to write any of that code. Ember does it for you. So when this template gets run, it's not only going to do controller.getFirstName and spit out the value, but it's also going to set up an observer on first name. And so every time that observer fires, which when first name changes, it's going to re-render just this part of the DOM. Right? So it's a very sort of surgical operation. Just the things that get changed get re-rendered. Same thing with last name. Now, this kind of syntax doesn't work nicely inside of a HTML attribute. So your first guess might be, my first guess was, I would say, oh, image src equals double curly brace image URL. And unfortunately, that syntax doesn't work for handlebars. There's future versions of handlebars that may make this cleaner, but in the meantime, the syntax is where your attribute would be, you would do bind attr, and then attribute name equals property path. So this would make the src property of image the person's image URL, and again, install an observer for you. Anytime it changes, update that src property, and your image would update. Question? The double curly braces is handlebars. So basically what handlebars is it's a string templating language. So this starts off life as just a string. Handlebars compilers turns it into a JavaScript function. That JavaScript function gets executed when you render this to the screen. It's the handlebars compiler itself that reads those curly braces, that parses them. Yeah. So when you go from this string and you want to prepare this to be ready for Ember to use, then this can either happen at runtime or during a build process. Handlebars is going to run it through a special part of itself called its compiler, and it's going to say, okay, when I've got this, when I render this, I'm going to get the first name property and put it here. I'm going to put in a couple of invisible markings so that I know what to update when first name changes, and I'm going to install an observer or a binding so that I know when first name changes. It's going to repeat that. Each time it sees one of these double curly braces, then it knows that it's got to do its magic there. Right. Yeah, so I don't have exactly. So I don't have an easy example there. I don't have code that shows that, but instead of saying template name, which is going to go and look up the template in a registry, if you could say template and have it be a JavaScript function, and that gets passed to context. And so when the template gets executed, it just basically runs that function, passing it a context. And so these handlebars templates just become JavaScript functions that take the context and execute.
If I want to like look into the rendering, well, let's say I want to fade out the image or fade in the new image or before the attribute changes.
Yeah.
Is this something I would do in the view or something I have to?
So probably the easiest way to do that, in sort of specific example, would be to have a class name that gets put on image when attached to a controller property, and in your controller you could observe image URL changing and set that class name to something else, and have some CSS that says, hey, the transition between this and this is this kind of fade out or whatnot. Yeah. Yeah. Well, actually, he did have handlebars templates in the example. He didn't spend a lot of time in them in the demo, but they were there. Yeah. So one of the reasons that I recommended reading the view code is because understanding the view lifecycle and what methods get called makes it possible to know how to hook in there. So for example, every view has a render method. And typically what render does is it calls the template method with the context. But there are places in our code where we just define our own render method and spit something out. And you might want to do that if you know that you don't need any kind of binding whatsoever. You just want to spit out something simple. You might do that if, I'm trying to think, you want to generate something that's like heavily programmatic that doesn't get composed well in handlebars. So maybe you've got some crazy SVG that you're spitting out that's, it's easier for you to render from some looping JavaScript than from a template. The trick is if you use that kind of hook is you're not going to get any of those observers installed for you for free the way that you do in handlebars. So you would want to make sure you set up your own observer and call re-render if you need to. So, but yeah, there's plenty of ways to hook in. You can also, theoretically, other templating languages can exist that implement the same approach that are not handlebars. There's nothing, there's no hard coupling there. Emblem works by compiling to handlebars, so that's kind of leveraging the handlebars stuff already. But Emblem could also be implemented not doing that. It could be implemented as its own thing that installs the observers, et cetera, on its own. So more template stuff. This is an example where say if person, print this out, else please log in. And Corey had some of this in his examples where it was if is dragging over, I think, or something like that, say one thing, otherwise say something else. This pound sign is a thing that you'll see frequently with handlebars helpers. This signifies a block helper. And the two types of handlebars experiences, one is without pound, which is just a standalone. You can think of it as a self-closing tag in HTML. And then the other is the pound helper, which means that there's going to be content and a closing tag. So /if closes that block helper. And this does exactly what you think it is. It does. It checks person. And if it's true, if person is truthy, most likely non-null in your application, you're going to spit this out. Otherwise, you're going to spit out please log in. What hopefully you're guessing and hoping that this does by now is that it also observes person. And so when person gets populated, without you having to do anything, it's going to flip from please log in to welcome back Alex Trebek. Make sense? Cool. So outlets. Outlets are placeholders. And they're just basically saying, hey, we're gonna another view is gonna get rendered here. Typically, the reason that you're having an outlet is because as you move around the application in your router, which we'll get to in a little bit, different views are going to get rendered. So think about going from a blog index page to a single post that has the post and comments. The main outlet of your application is going to, in one case, render your posts index template, and then when you move, it's going to render your post show template. It's important to be able to have multiple outlets and outlets at different levels because you don't want to change everything on the screen all at once. It wouldn't be a very cool JavaScript app if that happened. So instead, you'll target, and as you have nested routes, you will also have nested outlets, things that can change while much of the page stays the same. And it's the example here of a named outlet that you might fill more programmatically yourself. Might be for a sidebar. So templates. Now, if anybody's done any kind of templating whatsoever, you know that you need the ability to do some sort of nesting so that you don't end up with one humongous template. There's a few different ways to do this. There's a view helper where you can reference a view class that will get rendered here. If this view class is associated with the template itself, that template would get rendered. You can reference a template name directly. Let's say you don't have a view class, you don't want a view class. You can also have a partial. These are, for all intents and purposes, these are the same. When it looks up person, it will look it up with a leading underscore. So I think it's kind of silly to have both of them, but that's what's there today. Now, something that's important to understand here. When this template is rendered, the controller that properties are referring to in that template is still the same as at this level. So there's no change in scope when I use any of these helpers. And that contrasts with some of the things we'll look at next. If you do want to change scope within the same template, you can use the with helper. So here's an example. I might have welcome back person.firstname, person.lastname in handlebars templates, handlebars braces. Now, this is the first time that we've seen this, but yes, this works. You can have a property path here, and if either person changes or first name changes, those will update. But it gets a little verbose, and so one solution to that verbosity is you could say, with person, changing my scope to person, welcome back first name, last name. And again, this is bound, so this is being observed, this is being observed, this is being observed. These are going to function identical in your application. And again, we see the block helper, # /with at the end. Now, if you want to nest and change scope, most typically, oops, I caught a little tooltip in my screenshot there. So most typically you want to have a new controller in play. So the example here is we've got a post where we show the title and H1 tag, the body of the post, and then we want to render the author information. And we want to have a separate controller because this stuff can get a little bit complex, and so we just want to really isolate that and have a nice view controller combo for this section. So unlike the template helper or the view helper we referred to, render is going to look up the view for author, but it's also going to look up the controller for author, and it's going to set the content property of the controller to this object, author, and so then we can do things where we depend on models and alias of content, and we are going to get a count for how many posts does this particular author have. And then when we want to use it, it's going to render with that controller as the context, and this template up here as the template. So we can just say written by first name, because the context is here. This is an object controller. The content or model is the author. So first name is going to go check here, get proxied through to the model, render the first name, render the last name. When we go to post count, it's going to go to the controller and say, oh, I do have a property named post count, and so I'm going to return that value. Questions? Yes, that's correct.
So if I had two of those, it's going to be a problem.
Yes, that's correct.
And that's what this control helps.
Exactly.
Because at the moment, I mean, in my app, get me wrong, I was using named outlets to do this kind of thing multiple, and that's kind of wrong. But I don't know if that's the only way you're supposed to do it.
Yeah, I think control is probably the best way to do it right now. If you have a case where you're rendering a collection, so it's not just kind of two random places on the screen, but it's a collection of authors, say, then you can use each helper with item controller. We talked about it in Jeopardy a little bit earlier. That is going to give you an instance per and handle it correctly. And we'll get there with control. We just don't want to push it out to the public before it's ready. Oh yeah, question in the back. So the question is, if you have a collection of collections, would you have to use control? I think that the base case would be okay. I don't know, and you might have had that in Jeopardy, right? And Lee, I know Lee Nussbaum, who's in the back in the pink shirt here, is also has done some of that nested stuff. So if you want to talk with him about it, you guys can connect.
I'm actually going to leave in a moment. I wanted to ask a question that's a little bit higher level about Ember. I'm working on an app that's, you can think of it as like a hierarchical to-do list app with like progress bars rather than checkboxes and like notes and text.
Okay.
Kind of the equivalent. And I want it to be like a mobile web app that'll eventually wrap into a native app. And been debating with people whether to use Ember, which is like, I guess, using JavaScript to define the UI in the right language, or something like Knockout, which kind of binds the UI with HTML. Do you have any opinions on that? How to
Sure.
think through just using the right tool for the job, and when to know if Ember is the right tool?
Yep. So the question was, got an app that's kind of a sophisticated to-do list style app with multi-level hierarchy, and considering Knockout versus Ember, and the characterization of the difference, I think is that Ember uses JavaScript to do data binding, and Knockout uses HTML to do data binding. So the thing that I like about Ember's data binding versus Knockouts is that Knockout does data binding just in the view layer to the data layer, I guess, if you will, and not in the rest of the application. Observers and binding and computed properties are foundational to all of Ember. So whether you're building a controller, or building a model, or building doing some work in the router, or in your view, you're building the same thing, using these same fundamental constructs. So I find that more powerful from a like learning and toolkit perspective than having data binding be just something that I think about in terms of views, because I think it's way more powerful than that. So that's my general take. I haven't ever built a real app in Knockout, so it's hard. I mean, ideally you would find somebody who's done it in both.
I just rebuilt my Knockout app. And I mean, Knockout That was me. So.
All right, cool. So you just got your ideal feedback, your ideal candidate.
No one learning. So.
Question in the back? Yes. Yes. There's not a facility in Ember itself to do that. However, it's not. There's lots of build tools that will do that for you. So we use Rake Pipeline to do that. There's, I know, grunt-based workflows that do a good job at it. There's a library called Iridium that does it. Ember Rails project does it for inside of Rails using Asset Pipeline. So lots of ways to do it, and definitely, like, at scale, the pattern that you want is you want to have a templates directory with all your handlebars templates organized in whatever folder structure works best for you. And you don't want to have one index file with a whole bunch of script tags. It comes down. So if you're doing template pre-compilation, which I recommend and we do, it comes down as JavaScript functions, which go through the same minification process that the rest of your app would go through. So it's basically those templates. What we look at is, pretty or not pretty, depending on your perspective on handlebars, but certainly expressive. Templates end up as minified JavaScript functions. When you minify them, typically each of those files is like that function, and that function is assigned to ember.templates square bracket template name equals. Cool. Any questions before? So we've got, just so you guys know, I think we've got about 60 slides, and we're at 44. So I can go and fast forward. So firing events, actions are, now we start to go, so far we've just been observing and rendering. Now we're going to actually do something. We're going to let the user take some action in your application. And so the action helper basically enables the tag that it's put on to send a message, to do something important like select post. And it can send some data along with that post. In this case, it's going to send the post itself, along with that event, rather. That event gets sent to the controller. The controller has an opportunity to handle it. If you don't handle it in the controller, then it goes to the router. And again, if we remember, the router changes the world, and then the rest of your app responds. So we've been knocking around XL.
Well, you have an action to trickle down to the controller. Then the controller needs to do slide and toggle something. How would you handle that?
So I would probably set a property on the controller and have in my view, or my template be observing that property in some way. It might be a CSS class if you want to kind of slide something up. It might be a if-else. And that's a good example of when you might want to handle it in a controller. If it's just about like local view display, then it's a great idea to handle that action in the controller. If it's about changing something in a model, I like to let those go up to the router and act there. So we've been knocking around a few things that I just want to make sure we're clear on. There's some keywords when you're rendering templates and working with views. And these are the key keywords: controller, view, and context. At any given point, your template and view have each of these. The view is typically pretty clear what it is. It's the view associated with this template. If it might be an auto-generated one, right? If you just let Ember generate it for you. The controller and context are most often the same, but don't necessarily have to be. So context will start off as controller. Controller is obviously going to be the reference to the controller that the view was rendered with. But context is changeable separately from controller in some cases. One example is, do you remember we did pound with person, and then the context became the scope. I think I said became the person. What we did is we changed the context. So context is what a bare property name references. So If we say first name and context is controller, then it's going to look at controller.firstname. If we've changed the context to person and we say first name, it's going to look at person.firstname. So just something to think about as you're working in there. When context and controller become different, you might want to say at some places controller dot some property name, and that's perfectly valid. By default, if you don't specify an item controller, you're actually just going to have that model, the instance of that model, right? The instance of that array element. If you specify item controller, then you're going to have an object controller that's proxying that element. It's whatever you're going to say item controller equals person, or you're going to specify what type of item controller you want. So these are just some examples of those keywords. Just what becomes clear what I said, context is the bare word. You can reference controller or view explicitly. Binding to view properties is usually not a great idea. Sometimes it's worth it, but probably something to avoid. One controller per view. If you need data from elsewhere, use needs, or use the render helper to change scope to a new controller and a view combo. So there's a few different ways to handle DOM events. There's the Ember dispatched events, and Corey's talk was a great example of that. You can handle a whole bunch of different type of DOM events just by defining methods on the view. There's the handlebars action helper that we referenced, and you also have the power of jQuery whenever you want. I don't know if I think I have an example of that. So here's the example of Ember dispatched events. Mouse down. If I mouse down in the thumbnail, I'm going to do window.alert. This is the list of Ember dispatched events that are handled by default. If you want more, you can add them. When you create your application, you just specify them in custom events. These can be regular browser-supported events that just don't happen to be in that list, like mouse wheel. It can also be jQuery special events. So if you've ever implemented those, which can be really powerful, you can add those as custom events and then just handle them in your Ember app supernaturally. The action helper, I think we talked about already. Here's an example of using jQuery to handle events. So context, before I show the example to understand, is that views move from a pre-render state, which is they're not yet in DOM, to in DOM, and then eventually they are destroyed. And so views have a little internal state machine that cycle through. There's actually one or two other more states that I'm leaving out for simplicity. But there's some important hooks. After a view transitions into the in DOM state, which means its HTML is there, it's going to fire get insert element after in the DOM, and that gets fired on your view. And right before goes into the destroyed state, it's going to fire will destroy element. So again, this is when it's still in the DOM, but it's about to be removed. This is awesome because that's exactly the hooks that you need to do interesting things with jQuery. And you have a easy to access jQuery handle to the views element or jQuery wrapped element using this.dollar. So thumbnail view is a div. Maybe it's div class thumbnail, and then inside there's a image and a caption or something. If I say this.dollar, this is a jQuery reference to that div. And so maybe I have a jQuery plugin that I've loaded, a Lightbox plugin. I can simply say this.dollar Lightbox. And that jQuery plugin is going to attach whatever event handlers it does. And so when I click that thumbnail, it's going to Lightbox it for me. Now, typically, you need to clean up after yourself when you're attaching these kinds of event handlers to avoid memory leaks and that kind of thing. And so that's what you would do in will destroy element. Perhaps it's unbind, Lightbox, there's different ways to do. If you're doing event handlers yourself, you might do this.dollar $.on event name, and here you might do .off event name. But this is a really powerful way to use existing jQuery plugins, your own jQuery plugins. Now, once you go into sort of the land of a jQuery plugin, you may not have all the same facilities in terms of data binding and stuff like that, depending on how that works. So you're venturing a little bit off of the Ember path, but this is, don't feel bad about doing this at all. This is a great way to take advantage of a huge amount of open source projects that are out there. So view tips, remember, views are created and destroyed over the lifetime of an app over and over again and at render time. If I have an if-else and foo is rendered here, bar is rendered here, this is silly because I need a if something that I'm observing, but if I was, each time view is going to be destroyed and created as that property changes. That means I cannot store any kind of state on view that I need to be kept around. That state is going to be in the controller, and that's one of the reasons by default most controllers are these long-lived singletons, because we want to be able to preserve transient states so that when we hide a sidebar or a modal and then open it again, it looks the same as when we left it, if that's the desired behavior. It's also good practice for views to know as little as possible about their parent view hierarchy. There is a property you can say this.getParent view from inside a view and sort of reach up and ask your parent things. Sometimes that's okay, but if you find yourself doing that a lot, you might want to think about a different architecture. Maybe there's information that can be stored in the controller that you can bind to, stuff like that. Container view was mentioned. I'm not going to go into depth. It's a more advanced topic, but if each isn't enough, you want to really manually manage views. Container view is your key. I wrote that guide I wrote to try to make it clear. We use container views a fair bit, and they're super powerful. We didn't get into depth in this, but there's two types of kind of observable properties, bindings and computed properties. As you're first learning Ember, the binding syntax can be seductive, but I would try to use computed properties as much as possible. Bindings by default are two-way, and often, while that sounds great, and sometimes it is great, most of the time it's not what you need. You actually just need information to flow in one direction. And so if you've got two-way bindings when really all you need is one way, you can get unexpected behavior and spend time debugging stuff that was never really helping you in the first place. Sure. So bindings. Yep. So if I, on an Ember object, say first name binding colon controller dot person dot first name, what that's going to do is going to set up what's called a binding object, and it's going to install observers on both sides of that equation, on my view and on my controller person first name chain. And if either of those change, it's going to do a set in the other direction. Now, if that's a view in a controller, really what you probably want is it's only if the model and controller land change, you want the view to update, not two ways. Now, but maybe you have a form field, and as you type, you want your controller to have access to the most recent info, and as you set a property in the controller, you want the form field to be updated to reflect that. That's a great case for a two-way binding. So there's places where it's really useful, but this caveat is just make sure you're not using those out of laziness, because they can cause problems where you're not getting any benefit for them. And yes, that's why this makes the slide deck. So the question was, isn't it the default to have two-way bindings? Yes, and that's why what I reach for, my first thing I reach for is a computed property. So the router's response, yes.
Does that mean that to have a one-way binding, you just need property?
There's more than one way to do it. You can do ember.binding.oneway and then the path, but I would recommend just doing computed properties. And especially now that we have ember.computed.alias, as I showed before, it's no extra, not any extra syntax. So the router's responsibilities are that it manages application state and it keeps your URL up to date as you transition between routes. This is something that's the fact that the URL as a first-class citizen in Ember is something that's pretty awesome. And when Discourse first came out, there were a bunch of people that said, wait, single-page JavaScript out for a forum? You got to be kidding me. Like, URLs are like the lifeblood of forums. These things need to live on in search engines forever, and et cetera. But as people used it, they said, wow, like the URLs just work. And that's thanks to Ember Router. So the router is a state machine, and that's really powerful because it lets you compartmentalize and reason about different parts of your application in a way that can keep you sane, instead of thinking about your app as basically having one state where a user can do a whole lot of different things. You can sort of keep it more well-defined. This is the router DSL. Lets you sort of specify the possible URLs and paths, and it's kind of the foundation for the naming convention that'll happen. So to pick out just the simple example, if you say this resource users, then when you go to /users, the user template will be displayed, and the user's controller will be used as the context for that template, and if there's a user's view, that will be the view for that triad. Same as we move down. So each of these routes, let me do the next part and then I'll take questions on it. Each of these routes can have an optional route class that you define. This is another case of active generation. If you just want the default behavior, you don't have to define this. If you want to customize it at all, then create it and it will be used. So we talked about actions flowing up to the router. This is how you handle them. In a given route, you have an events hash and you say the name of the action. So I think in the example I did before, it was show post or select post, I think. I could have select post here and it would get called, and the argument here would be whatever the context I passed in. So in that case, it was the post. At this point, I could set a property on a model, set a property on a controller, persist something, retrieve something from an API, lots of possibilities. But then any of those things that I change in the model or controller layer would flow down to be rendered. In addition to specifying events on routes, there's a ton of hooks, a bunch of hooks to override the conventional behavior when needed. So this was the example of the model method, set up controller, someone they mentioned, render template. These are all things that have a basic implementation that's right 90% of the time, and that you may want to override in some cases. So this is another great part of the source code to read if you're looking to read some source and understand important parts of Ember. Questions? Oh, there's a bunch of hands that went up. Yeah. The difference between a resource and a route. Yeah, I think that routes are leaf nodes. Is that a correct explanation, would you say?
Yeah, that's true. The other thing to know about resources is that, so for instance, in that case, you have resources post, and then you have route show inside of it. That basically means that the default naming convention is the case for that the route class handling post show is default post show route, right? So I guess the only other thing to know about that is that if you have a bunch of like nested resources inside of each other, their naming convention doesn't like continue to stack. If you have like a resource inside post that's comments, and then start comments for the show route, you're going to have post comments show. Every resource becomes sort of like its top level name. So if you have your comments resource as post, you get comments post route or whatever. But yes, I mean, the basic question is resources are narrowly defined as a parent route by having a bunch of unique routes nested inside of it that their users get that route.
Isn't that directly Rails like style?
Very, very similar to the Rails router.
Actually, the route I think back to Rails.
Yeah.
Very, very, that's actually closer to the controller than a Rails route.
Yes, because the control in Rails, the question is the route class kind of closer to what a controller does in Rails? I think that would be a fair estimation, kind of is taking in the request and doing the basic setup, and then something else is going to take over for rendering. Similar. So controllers are kind of more associated with presenters if you've used that pattern in Rails. Yep. Yeah. You would use the model hook and then take the slug and use that to look up your model and return it. And again, I didn't list out the hooks here, but the hooks are in the API. So emberjs.com/API has full API docs that are generated from the source code. And the Ember route lists all those hooks out. So a few tips. Be careful about asynchronicity when in your router event handlers. So if you handle an event using this sort of syntax, my cool action, and then you do something asynchronous, and you have a callback, be careful. You don't want to assume that you're still in the post-index route when you get that callback, because the user could have clicked away, hit the back button, whatever. So it's better usually if you have something asynchronous, when you get the callback, fire a new event by doing this.send event name and optional context. And that way, if you're still in this route, you could handle it here. If you're in a different route, then it can handle it. The other thing I should mention is that action handling is hierarchical, so it's going to flow up the route hierarchy. In this example, if I handle something here, if an event goes into this state, but there's no event handler for it, it's going to go up and check this route to see if there's an event handler here, and then eventually up into application route. Yeah, we're wrapping up. So you guys are going to laugh, but I was actually thinking like all this week that we were going to be so short on content this month, and yeah, it didn't happen. So I think that, so we have naming conventions we've talked a little bit about. There's this chart. This chart is in the routing guide on Ember.js you can check out. But this is really important. If you're taking advantage of active generation and you want to create something, you need to know the name. And so again, Excel. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. So the point is that when you use controller for, or actually any kind of container lookup, it's going to use an underscored version. So if it's posts favorites controller, and you would say controller for lowercase posts underscore favorites. And if you're doing container lookup, you'd say container lookup lowercase controller colon lowercase posts underscore favorites. So again, now this is just the same slide as the beginning, but just now knowing sort of each of these fundamental building blocks, you want to build your app so that data is flowing down from your model through your controller, being presented by your controller nicely to your optional view, and eventually rendered by your template. And then events are going to flow up through DOM events to the view, semantic events to the controller or router, that are then going to make changes to the model and controller layer and complete the cycle, this virtuous cycle of Ember. And that is all I've got for tonight. Thank you all for bearing with me.